My name is Elara. I'm 32 years old. And tonight, I wore the only black dress I own, not because it's slimming or elegant, or even because I wanted to be noticed. I wore it because it feels like armour. Soft, tight armour, stitched with silence. I hadn't been home in nearly 3 years. Not really. I'd shown up at Christmas once, handed out awkward hugs, and escaped before the wine was served. But tonight, for reasons I still can't explain to myself, I walked into my parents' house like I belonged there. The smell hit me first. Rosemary lamb, red wine, citrus cleaner. That blend of comfort and clinical tension that only lives in the kitchens of women who host too much and feel too little. The table was already set. White linens, silver napkin rings. My mother still does that thing where she folds the corners into swans, as if origami can fix old wounds. And there they all were, my sister Arabella, perfect as ever, already seated beside her husband, Jasper. My father at the head, carving meat like he was splitting atoms. My mother fluttering, always fluttering. No one stood when I entered. Just a few nods, a murmured, "You look well," and Arabella's thin smile, the kind that never touches her eyes. I used to think she hated me. Now I'm not so sure she ever felt anything at all. "You came," my father said, without looking up. I did. And then, just like that, I was seated at the far end, beside the drafty window. The place where the leaves tap the glass when the wind picks up. My chair had no cushion. Arabella was glowing. She's always glowing. Her skin is flawless. Her hair pinned back like a bridal magazine cover, even though she's been married for 5 years. Jasper reached for her hand mid-toast. Everyone cooed. "I just want to say how proud I am of this family," my father began, voice booming with the kind of authority that used to silence me instantly. Arabella just made partner at her firm. Jasper's opening a second office, and Claire, he nodded to my cousin, seated too close to the centrepiece, is starting her residency. This family thrives. He paused, looked around. His gaze never landed on me. And then it came, like a knife disguised as a compliment. "Even Elara's here? That's nice." There was a silence, thick as syrup. Arabella giggled. "It's good to have you back. Ella, we were just wondering if you were still..." "Waitressing." The word dangled in the air like it had claws. "She works at a cafe, actually," my mother added quickly, not looking at me. "Very cosy." I said nothing. I reached for my water. It tasted like shame. No one asked me anything else. The conversation rolled on without me. House prices, private schools, a new ski trip in February. Jasper mentioned something about IPOs, and I watched the way Arabella's fingers curled around his wrist like ivy. And then, as dessert was being passed, panna cotta with citrus zest, Arabella's favourite, Jasper turned, not slightly, not subtly. He turned fully toward me. "Elara," he said, eyes locked on mine. "How's the app going?" The table froze. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, no one knew. Not my family. Not even Arabella. Because I never told them. Because when you've been labelled the failure for so long, even your wins start to feel like secrets. But Jasper knew. Of course he did. And that was the moment everything shifted. I could feel every pair of eyes twitch in my direction, like the table had tilted, and I was suddenly standing at its centre, exposed, dissected. "The app," Arabella said, smiling too sweetly. "What app?" Jasper didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on me, steady and unreadable. I had forgotten how sharp he was, how careful he could be with his words. There was something about the way he asked, not with curiosity, but precision. I forced a breath. It's still in beta, I said, swallowing the nerves rising like bile. A productivity suite for freelancers. Time tracking, invoicing, project nesting. It's called Loom. Arabella tilted her head, like she was squinting at a painting she didn't understand. Since when do you code she doesn't? Jasper answered for me. She hired 2 developers, found them on GitHub, negotiated equity-only contracts. Very lean. He knew everything. I hadn't spoken to Jasper in years, not since the week he married my sister. He had congratulated me back then on launching my candle line on Etsy. I thought it was polite small talk. Apparently, he remembered more than I did. How do you know all this? Arabella's voice was tight now, brittle at the edges. Jasper finally looked at her. I read her Medium post. It went viral 2 months ago. She broke down her build process. It was sharp. Got linked on Product Hunt. My mother blinked, her spoon halfway to her mouth. I didn't know you were writing articles, she murmured, as though I'd published erotica. I didn't think anyone here would be interested. I said, calm, even like I was watching someone else speak through me. Arabella's fingers gripped the stem of her wine glass, like it was something she could snap. And then, the pivot. My father cleared his throat. Well, he said slowly, it's good you found something to focus on. Structure is important. That was all. No questions, no curiosity, just that hollow nod people give before changing the subject. I felt it then, that invisible wall being built again, brick by brick, between me and the rest of them. Jasper was the only one who hadn't looked away. The silence was swelling again when Claire, sweet, oblivious Claire, chimed in. Elara, she said gently, you live alone now. Right. That must be hard, running all that by yourself. It was pity dressed as interest. I'm used to being alone. I replied too quickly, too honestly, and I saw it land. In Jasper's eyes, in my mother's brief flinch. Even Arabella's smile dimmed. We finished dessert in quiet. I excused myself before the coffee was poured. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scratched the windows like they were trying to get in. I stood on the porch with my coat pulled tight and stared out at the lawn, still perfectly trimmed, still sterile, like everything else here. I should have felt proud, I suppose. Jasper had seen me, recognised the thing I'd built in silence, but all I could feel was the gaping hollow inside me, the realisation that I hadn't wanted recognition. Not like that. Not from him. I wanted someone, anyone, to have asked before it became impressive, to have cared when it was still fragile. That was the part they never understood. Success isn't a flag you plant. It's a bandage you wear over what no one else could be bothered to see. The porch light flickered. Behind me, the door opened. Footsteps. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. You didn't tell her, Jasper said quietly. No, I replied. He was beside me now, not close, but present. Why I stared ahead? Because it wasn't hers to know. A beat of silence. She doesn't see you. I almost laughed. None of them do. I did. I looked at him then. Really looked. And I saw it. The crease in his brow. The caution behind his words. He was trying not to step into something too deep. trying not to drown in a truth he wasn't ready to hold. "You married her," I said flatly. He nodded. "And you vanished." There was nothing else to say. He didn't apologize. I didn't ask him to. We stood there for another minute, two people orbiting the same storm. When I went back inside, no one noticed, except Arabella. She saw me re-enter, saw the way Jasper followed behind. Slower. Her eyes narrowed. Something inside her shifted, and I felt it for the first time. Not fear, not shame, but the faint, steady pulse of something long buried. Power. The next morning, I didn't sleep in. I couldn't. The guest room was still the same. Cold, impersonal, a place that had been decorated more for appearances than for comfort. The floral bedding was stiff with starch. The old desk under the window hadn't been touched in years. And in the closet, my childhood things were gone, replaced by winter coats my mother rotated seasonally, as if the room had never belonged to a person at all. It was always like that with her. Rooms weren't meant for memories. They were meant to be presentable. I stared at the ceiling for hours, heart rattling in my chest like something small and angry. I thought about the dinner, about Jasper, about the way Arabella's smile had faltered, and I knew she had seen something. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel the imbalance, the shift, that tiny crack in her carefully constructed life, and cracks have a way of growing. By mid-morning, I was downstairs. No one was in the kitchen. The air smelled like lemon again. The only sound was the ticking of the antique wall clock, a gift my father once gave my mother when I was 12. I remember because it was the same day I won a writing contest. He didn't say a word about it. I made tea and stepped outside, barefoot on the back porch. The grass was still wet. Dew clung to my ankles like memory. I had my phone in my hand. I hadn't posted in days, not since the article took off. I had dozens of DMs I hadn't opened. Investors, collaborators, strangers asking if I needed a COO. I'd wanted to process it privately, but now it felt different. I opened my email instead, tapped into my pitch deck, scanned the numbers. Our waitlist was climbing, and we were only 4 weeks from launch. I smiled to myself, not out of pride, out of relief. I was not the failure. They had simply chosen not to look. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of town, past the park where I used to read on the benches, past the ice cream shop where Arabella once pushed me into a trash can for wearing her shirt. I remembered every crack in the sidewalk, every burnt-out lamppost that had never been replaced. The graveyard was quiet, as always. My mother hated that I visited, said it was dramatic, but I came every time I returned, even if it was just for a few minutes. I found the headstone easily. It was smaller than the others. Simple. No scripture. No frills. Mira, Bavos, 1986-2005. Loved. Lost. Remembered. My sister. The one no one talks about. The one we weren't allowed to bring up at dinners or holidays. My mother once slapped my hand just for saying her name. Mira died when I was 12. She was 19. She'd taken a handful of pills in her bedroom. My father called it an accident, but even then, I knew better. She had tried, and no one had listened. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if she'd lived. If she'd seen Arabella marry Jasper. If she'd seen me fail, then crawl back to my feet. If we'd both sat at the far end of that long dinner table, laughing at the absurdity of it all. I knelt beside her grave and pulled a folded piece of paper from my coat. It was old, faded, one of her poems. She used to write them on receipts, napkins, envelopes, anything she could find. I kept them, the ones my mother hadn't thrown away. This one was just 4 lines. We are not born from light, but carved from the quiet shadow, where nothing blooms without pain, and pain is how we grow. I read it aloud, let the words hang in the still, chilled air. Then I folded it again and placed it on the stone. I'm still here, I whispered, and I see it now. I see why you couldn't stay, but I will. The wind stirred, the trees shivered, and somewhere, deep in my chest, something began to unlock. A memory, sharp and sudden. Arabella, crying, at Mira's funeral. And Jasper, standing with her, his hand on her shoulder, staring at me like I wasn't supposed to be there. I hadn't thought about that in years. But it wasn't grief on his face. It was fear. Why? That look, that flash of fear in Jasper's eyes. It clung to me like fog. All afternoon, I tried to shake it. Maybe I'd misremembered. It had been almost 2 decades. After all, faces blur, emotions distort. Time distills the rawness of a moment into something you can stomach. But not this. I could still see the way he had stood back, tense, like I was something unpredictable, like I knew something I shouldn't. I returned to the house just before dusk. The family had scattered. My father in his study, probably with his brandy and an outdated leadership book. My mother on the phone in the living room, voice soft and performative. Claire was gone. And Arabella. Arabella was nowhere to be found. I went upstairs. The door to the master bedroom was slightly open. Voices inside. I paused at the top of the stairs. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Or maybe I did. After so many years of being kept outside the circle, what harm could a few overheard words do now? Why would you bring it up Arabella's voice? Sharp, barely restrained. She deserves to be seen. Jasper replied, calm, measured, the same way he used to sound when diffusing arguments between classmates in law school. She's not part of this. She left. You think that excuses how your family treats her. A pause. She doesn't belong anymore. I backed away before I could hear more. My chest was hot. My fingers curled into fists without thinking. I wasn't surprised, but somehow the words still hurt. Not because they were new, but because they were old, recycled, familiar, like the chorus of a song I'd heard too many times. I went back to my room and opened my laptop. There, in a folder buried beneath invoices and UX wireframes, was the file I hadn't touched in over a year, untitled Family Archive. I'd started it after my last Christmas visit, when Arabella made a passive-aggressive joke about my chronic instability over eggnog. I'd said nothing, but when I got back to my apartment, I opened my notes app and started compiling emails, screenshots, voicemails, old texts, inheritance documents, things Mira had sent me before she died, fragments, really, including a blurred photo of her diary cover, the last page partially visible. A single line stood out if it gets worse. I'll tell Elara. She's the only one who doesn't lie. I had never told anyone about that. Not Jasper, not Arabella, not even myself, really. I buried it, because believing it meant confronting the possibility that Mira's death wasn't just sadness, that it wasn't only about depression or distance, that maybe it was about betrayal. And suddenly, I remembered something else. The drawer in Mira's old desk, the one with the lock that was always missing its key. I didn't even think. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and padded down the hall, barefoot, breath shallow. My mother had turned Mira's old room into a linen closet, but the desk was still there, hidden beneath folded tablecloths and spare towels. I dragged them aside and opened the top drawer. Empty. The second, just old pens. The third, stuck. I tugged harder. It groaned but gave way. At the back, behind a stack of long expired bank statements, was a bundle wrapped in plastic. A cracked diary. The cover read Mira V. 2003. My pulse thudded. I turned the first page, and it hit me like a wave of ice. He watches me when Arabella isn't looking. I stared at the words. My breath caught. A strange ringing filled my ears. He says she wouldn't believe me, that he'll ruin me if I tell, that it's just between us. No. My knees buckled, and I sat on the floor, the diary trembling in my hands. Jasper. The dates lined up. The tone. The way Mira had started pulling away. Her last year alive. I hadn't noticed then. I hadn't understood what her silence meant. But now, I did. This wasn't just a family dinner. This wasn't about resentment or exclusion. This was a sickness, a rot, and it had been here all along. I closed the diary gently, as if it were made of glass. Then I stood, cradling it like a relic. The air in the hallway felt different now, like it knew. And for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel uncertain. I felt awake. I didn't sleep that night. The diary stayed beside me on the bed like a second heartbeat. I couldn't open it again. Not yet. Just touching it felt like waking something that had been buried too long. But it pulsed there, just the same. Whispering truths that rewrote everything I thought I knew about Mira's final months. About Jasper. About Arabella. The house was silent, except for the wind creaking against the windows. I lay in the dark and watched shadows move across the ceiling, one after the other like passing thoughts. And I kept seeing her handwriting. That first page. The weight of it. He watches me when Arabella isn't looking. I remembered how close they had all been back then. Jasper was practically living here the year Mira died. I thought it was because he loved Arabella, because he wanted to impress our parents. But now, that image was poisoned. Each shared dinner, each laugh echoing in the living room. What had I missed? No, what had I ignored? Because deep down, even then, I'd known something was off. Mira had changed. She was quieter, shakier. Once, I walked into her room and she slammed her laptop shut like I'd caught her doing something shameful. I thought it was just stress. Just Mira being Mira, but it wasn't. She had been cornered, and none of us had seen her. No, we had chosen not to. By dawn, I had made a decision. I dressed quietly and slipped downstairs with the diary tucked into my coat. I didn't want anyone to see it. Not yet. Especially not Arabella. She'd ask too many questions. Or, worse, not ask any at all. I drove out to the one place that had always felt untouched by my family's rot, the library on Grant Street. It opened early, and it was quiet, a sanctuary of whispers and old paper. I took a seat by the window, opened the diary to the second page, and began to read. The entries weren't in full sentences, more like fragments, but they painted a picture clearer than anything I'd ever seen. He touches the back of my neck when she's not around. Said I was beautiful. Said he was sorry. I told him to stop. He laughed. If I say anything, I'll ruin her life. I want to disappear. Entry after entry, it all unravelled. He had manipulated her, cornered her, guilt-tripped her into silence, made her believe that speaking out would destroy Arabella's happiness. that she was selfish for even thinking of telling the truth. And Mira, kind, loyal, broken Mira, had chosen silence. She had chosen to disappear instead of destroy. I sat there for what felt like hours, flipping through the months of agony, until I reached the final page. I almost told Elara, but then I saw Arabella with him, laughing, kissing him like she couldn't breathe without him. If she ever found out, she'd hate me. So I'll go, quietly. I love you, Elle. Please don't hate me for not saying it out loud. My throat burned. I covered my mouth, but the sob came through anyway. Small, muffled, but real. The kind of cry you never want anyone to see, because she had tried to tell me, in the only way she knew how, and I hadn't heard her. I looked up, blinking fast. A woman across the room met my gaze, concerned, but polite enough not to ask. I turned the diary over, stared at the frayed edges, and I knew what I had to do, but not loud, not with rage. That wasn't Mira's way, and it wasn't mine. No, if I was going to break this open, it would be quiet, precise, undeniable, because the truth didn't need to scream. It just needed to be seen. By the time I left the library, I had a plan. Not revenge. Not yet. Just exposure. First, I made 3 high-res scans of every page, saved them in an encrypted folder, then emailed them to a legal contact I'd met during my app's fundraising round. She'd once mentioned a passion for cases involving long-buried abuse. She had no idea how personal this would become. Then, I printed 2 copies of the full journal, bound them, one for Arabella, one for the press, if it came to that. I didn't know what Arabella would do with the truth. I didn't even know if she was capable of accepting it. But I was done keeping her comfortable. The next step was simple. I would wait, not for guilt, not for an apology, but for the moment they finally saw me. Not as the failure, but as the witness. The one they had forgotten to silence. The house felt different when I returned. Heavier, like it knew something was about to break. Arabella was in the garden, pruning roses that didn't need pruning. She looked perfect, as always. No one watching her would guess her world was about to shift. I slipped upstairs without speaking. The copies of the diary were in my bag, weightless in mass but devastating in meaning. I set one down on the desk in my guest room and stared at it. I had options. Option 1, confrontation. Walk right up to her, put it in her hands, and say the name she'd never expect to hear again. Option 2, silence. Let her find it. Let the words speak for themselves. I chose neither. I waited. That evening, dinner was quieter. Just the 4 of us. My parents, Arabella, and me. Jasper was working late, convenient, or perhaps strategic. My mother poured wine like nothing had changed. My father went on about local politics. Arabella sat with her hands folded, smiling politely, but there was a tension around her mouth, a tightness. She was unravelling and didn't know from which thread. I said little, just enough to pass as present, but my thoughts were elsewhere, on the copy upstairs, and the message I'd sent Jasper 2 hours earlier. We need to talk. You know what it's about. Come alone. I hadn't heard back, but I didn't need to. He would come. I could feel it. Shame has gravity. After dinner, I went for a walk. Not far, just around the block. I needed the air, the space. I passed houses lit from within, lives unfolding, none of them knowing what I was holding in my chest like a live wire. When I returned, his car was in the driveway. It was time. I walked past the living room without stopping, up the stairs. My heart thudded with every step. He was waiting in the hallway outside the guest room, hands in his pockets, eyes dark. "You found it," he said softly. So he knew exactly what it was. No denial, no confusion, just guilt. I looked at him. Why he didn't speak, why her still silence. My voice was barely above a whisper. She was 17. Jasper. His face broke just slightly, a flicker of something human beneath the polished mask. "I was young," he said finally. "Stupid. She was a child. I didn't touch her," he said too quickly. "Not really. I said things I shouldn't have. She misunderstood." No. I cut him off. Don't reduce her to a misunderstanding." He swallowed hard. "It was one mistake. I married Arabella. I moved on. Amira didn't." I said, "She died. Jasper." His shoulders dropped. "You don't understand. I understand everything." My voice cracked. "I understand that you made her feel unsafe in her own home, that you made her choose between protecting her sister and protecting herself, that you buried what you did beneath your perfect marriage and your second office and your tailored suits." He stepped forward. I stepped back. "Don't," I warned. "There's a copy. In Arabella's room. Another's with someone who will publish it if anything happens to me." His hands lifted. "I'm not threatening you. You don't have to." I said, "Men like you never do. You just exist, and the rest of us shrink." A long silence stretched between us. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want her to know," I said. "Arabella, I want her to see you clearly. For once." He nodded, slowly. "And then I'll decide." He turned to leave, paused at the stairs. "You think this will ruin her?" I didn't blink. "No, you already did that." When he was gone, I sat on the edge of the bed. I stared at the copy on the desk, sealed in a plain white envelope. I didn't know how Arabella would respond. Maybe she would deny it. Maybe she'd scream. Maybe she'd hate me. But none of that mattered now, because the truth was no longer buried. It had a pulse again, and it was mine to protect. Arabella found the envelope the next morning. I knew the moment it happened. I was downstairs, sipping black tea at the kitchen table, watching a droplet of condensation slide down the glass. Everything around me was still, except my chest, which felt like a war drum, slow and deafening. Then I heard her footsteps on the stairs. Not the graceful glide she usually carried, but sharp, uneven steps. Her heels clicked like something had cracked beneath her. She entered the kitchen holding the envelope, unopened, gripped so tightly the corner had bent. "Elara." Her voice was low, controlled, but I heard the shake beneath it. I didn't respond. "What is this? You should read it," I said softly. She set the envelope on the table between us, like it was contaminated. Her fingers lingered on it. She stared at it as though opening it would change something fundamental inside her. "I'm not going to play whatever game this is," she snapped. "If this is some pathetic way to get attention, it's Mira's diary," I said. She went still. I watched her face change. First disbelief, then confusion, and then that flicker of something darker. She picked the envelope back up, slower this time, and unsealed it. She read in silence. It took minutes, long ones. Her fingers trembled slightly with each turned page. Her eyes didn't move much, but I could see the tension building in her jaw, the way her shoulders curled forward like she was bracing for a blow. By the time she reached the last entry, she was pale, She closed the diary, slowly, as if it might dissolve in her hands. Then she looked up at me. "You're lying." The words hit like ice water, but I didn't flinch. "It's her handwriting. You could have faked it." "Why would I? Because you've always hated me," she hissed. "You were always jealous. You wanted what I had. I wanted her to live," I said, voice cutting through her panic like a blade. "That's all I ever wanted." She stood suddenly, pushing her chair back with a screech. "No, this is twisted. He would never. He loved me. I think he did, in his own way, but that doesn't make what he did to her disappear. He didn't touch her." "Does that make it better?" I demanded. He preyed on her trust, her silence. He knew she wouldn't tell you. He used that. Arabella's hands were shaking now. "She never told me," she whispered. "Not once." She almost did. She left that last page for me. I was 12. Arabella, I didn't understand, but I do now. Tears welled in her eyes. Not gentle ones, violent ones, like a dam breaking. I married him. I know. I built my life with him. I loved him. I know. I repeated, and I'm sorry. But Mira was our sister. She covered her face with both hands. Her body folded like it couldn't hold itself upright anymore. And then, to my surprise, she didn't collapse. She stood up straight, wiped her face, and met my gaze, steady. "Where is he?" I swallowed. "He knows you've read it. I told him last night." "What did he say? That it was a mistake?" "That he was young." Her voice turned cold. So was she. She stared down at the envelope one more time. "Is there a copy?" "Yes. With someone outside this family. If anything happens to me, it goes public." Arabella nodded, slowly, as if some part of her, maybe for the first time, truly saw me. Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't follow. Not then. I gave her time. 3 hours later, I found her in Mira's room, sitting on the floor with the second copy of the diary, reading it again. This time, she didn't cry. She just looked up and said, "Do you remember her laugh?" I nodded, like glass wind chimes. Arabella smiled, but it cracked almost immediately. She deserved better than this. She did. Arabella held the diary to her chest. "Do you want revenge?" she asked. "No," I said. "I want truth. I want her story to matter." Arabella stared out the window, then back at me. "I'll talk to him. Alone." "Okay. And after that?" "I don't know." "That's all right." I said, "Knowing is the first step. Doing is the second." She didn't answer, but I could see something in her had shifted. Not fully, not completely, but the armor had cracked. The script had broken, and that was enough. For now. She didn't come home that night. Arabella, not a text, not a call, nothing. My parents didn't ask, or maybe they knew not to. My father buried himself in a newspaper he didn't read. My mother scrubbed an already clean stovetop like it owed her something. The silence between us was dense, cloying, like everyone was pretending the centre of the family hadn't just cracked open. But I knew where she'd gone. She was with him, with Jasper, facing what I had already faced. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't be simple. You don't just unravel a marriage built on denial. You don't just walk away from the man you built your future around, the man your parents celebrated, the man you thought was safe. Even if the truth is staring you in the face, it still takes time to see it clearly. I stayed up, just in case. around 2 a.m. I heard the car, then footsteps, slow, dragging. The front door creaked open, then closed. I waited. My bedroom door was ajar. Arabella passed the threshold and paused outside. I saw the shadow of her frame, lit by the hallway's soft gold. "Elara," she whispered. Barely a breath. I sat up. "I'm here." She didn't move for a moment. Then she stepped in, shut the door behind her and leaned against it. I asked him. She said. I looked him in the eye. I asked if he remembered touching her, talking to her like that, scaring her, and he didn't deny it. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. "I slapped him," she added, like she was narrating someone else's actions. Then I cried. Then I screamed. I told him I couldn't breathe in the same room with him anymore. She looked at me, her eyes raw. I asked why. He said Mira was fragile, that she misunderstood, that he was the one who felt confused back then. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Can you believe that he made himself the victim? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Arabella walked to the window, crossed her arms, stared out at the night like it might offer a solution. "I don't think I ever really knew him," she murmured. "Not truly." "I think you did," I said quietly. "But you didn't want to." She turned to me. Not angrily, just broken. "What do I do now?" I hesitated, then said, "That's not for me to answer." She nodded, slowly. "But you already made a choice. You could have destroyed him the second you found that diary. Publicly, loudly. But you didn't. I wanted you to choose. I said, he stole that choice from Mira. I didn't want to do the same to you." Arabella sat down on the edge of my bed. "He offered me an escape," she said softly. "Said we could move. Start over. That no one else had to know. And I told him I'd think about it. I went still." "Arabella." I lied. I exhaled. She turned to me, her face hardening now, becoming steel beneath the sorrow. "I'm filing for separation. Tomorrow. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I want my own accounts unfrozen, and I want my name off anything tied to him. What about the press?" She paused. "I'll decide that part soon, but the truth isn't going anywhere. You made sure of that." We sat in silence again. Sisters? Just two girls once separated by miles of unspoken things. Now bound again by something Mira left behind. Finally. Arabella reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A charm, a tiny glass pendant with a dried violet inside. "I found this in Mira's things. I kept it. I don't know why." She pressed it into my palm. "She'd want you to have it," she said. She always said violets were for quiet strength. I held the charm like it was a heartbeat. "Thank you," I whispered. Arabella stood. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. "I'll stay with a friend until things settle." "Will you be okay?" "No," she admitted. "But I will be free." And somehow, that felt more powerful. She left the room without another word. I stared at the charm in my hand for a long time. Mira had planted a seed, not with vengeance, not with fury, but with truth. And now, it was finally blooming. The next morning, she was gone. Arabella, her room was empty, the bed smoothed out like no one had ever slept there. Her suitcase was missing. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the hallway, that expensive, cold lavender scent she always wore like armour. I stood in the doorway for a long time. It didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like closure, either. It felt like a window had finally opened in a house that had been sealed for decades. Downstairs, My parents were sitting at the kitchen table, both dressed as if it were any other Sunday. My father in his stiff collared shirt, sleeves rolled just so, reading a financial brief. My mother stirring her tea in endless, soundless circles. I sat across from them. They didn't look up. "She left," I said. My mother blinked slowly. "Who, Arabella?" Still no movement, no shock, as if they'd already sensed the shift and chosen, consciously, not to acknowledge it. My father flipped the page of his paper. "She has her moods." I stared at him. "She filed for separation." He froze, just briefly. "Then that's not our concern. She found out what Jasper did to Mira." The silence cracked. My mother finally met my eyes. Her lips parted. That was never confirmed. "She wrote about it," I said. "In her diary? Page after page. That could mean anything." She was scared. "She tried to tell me. She wrote that you wouldn't believe her." My mother went still. My father set his paper down. "This is enough." "No," I said. "It's not." His jaw tightened. "It was a long time ago. We are not revisiting this. She died because we didn't revisit it. She died alone in her room, while you were busy being respected and admired by people who had no idea what was happening under this roof. We gave you everything," my mother snapped. "A home, a name, an education. You gave me a checklist," I said, but never a voice. They didn't respond. I stood. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'm not staying in a house where the truth is treated like dirt under a rug." "Where will you go?" my mother asked, her voice sharp, like she hadn't meant to care but couldn't help it. "Anywhere. Somewhere with air. Somewhere Mira would have felt safe." And then I said it. "I'm going to speak." Their faces tightened in tandem. To who, my father asked. "Anyone who'll listen. Maybe the press. Maybe a lawyer. Maybe just people like me who thought they were crazy because no one else saw the rot growing in their own families." My mother shook her head. "You'll shame this family." "No," I said. "You already did that. I'm just naming it." I turned and walked out before they could stop me. In my car, I sat behind the wheel, breathing. The air outside was thick, but it didn't suffocate me anymore. The house behind me shrank in the mirror like a bad dream. I called Arabella. She answered on the third ring. "Where are you?" I asked. "Somewhere coastal," she said. I needed to hear the sea. "I'm going back to the city." "Good." There was a pause. "I don't know what I'm going to do with all of this," she said. "With him. With myself. You don't have to know yet. I feel hollow. And alive. At the same time. That's what the truth does." I whispered. "It burns. But it clears." After we hung up, I drove. The farther I got from that house, the more I felt my breath return to me. Not all at once, but in pieces. The weight on my chest didn't vanish, but it shifted. I still had Mira's charm around my neck, the tiny violet under glass. I touched it once as I crossed the county line, and I promised her, silently, that I would not let this end in whispers. Not this time. This time, the truth would be seen. The city greeted me like it always did, loud, indifferent, alive. I parked 2 blocks from my apartment and walked the rest of the way, letting the cold bite into my cheeks. I wanted to feel it. The sting, the change, something real on my skin that reminded me I was back in my world, not theirs, inside my apartment. Everything was just as I'd left it. Minimal, clean, quiet, The candle I'd been testing on my desk had melted down to a stub. My notebook lay open beside it, still on the same page I'd written the day before the dinner. When do we stop apologising for surviving? I sat down and stared at those words for a long time. Then I opened my laptop. The email from the journalist I'd contacted was sitting in my inbox, flagged, unopened. I read it twice. Elara. I read the scans. I'm sorry for what your sister went through. If you're ready, I want to help you tell her story. This deserves to be seen. I stared at the blinking cursor on the reply box for several minutes. Was I ready? The thought of going public, of taking Mira's private pain and putting it under glass for strangers to gawk at, felt violent, but not more violent than what had been done to her. And if even one girl read her story and saw herself. Wasn't that reason enough? I replied. Yes, let's talk. An hour later, I was pacing my living room, rehearsing the story in my head. Not the app, not the success, not the polite, sanitized version. The real story. How Mira's diary was buried, how silence is curated, how families turn inward and rot quietly behind curated brunches and throw pillows. That night, I lit a new candle, my own blend, lavender and violet, Mira's favourites. It filled the room with something soft and haunting. I left the windows open just a little, letting in the wind, letting her in. 2 days later, I sat across from the journalist in a quiet cafe tucked into the corner of a bookstore. Her recorder sat between us, blinking red. Start wherever you want, she said gently. This isn't for clicks. We'll handle it with care. So I did. I started with the dinner, the insult, the app, and then Mira. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But instead, I spoke with a clarity I hadn't known I was capable of. Each sentence came like a stone pulled from a riverbed, heavy, smooth, real. When I read the diary aloud, the journalist didn't interrupt once. She just nodded, listened, wrote, and, when I finished, she reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. She was lucky to have you, she said. I shook my head. I was too late, but you're not now. The story went live a week later. It wasn't explosive, not at first. It was quiet, like Mira. A slow, steady tide that rose across inboxes, timelines, newsletters, and then the messages started coming, from women, from girls, from people who had buried things, too. Some said, thank you. Some said, me too. Some said, now I understand what happened to me. The ripple became a wave. Jasper lost 2 clients. Then 4. Arabella texted me. He's trying to spin it, but people aren't buying it. Good. I didn't want him ruined. I wanted him seen. There's a difference, because shame doesn't live in secrets. It lives in exposure. And Mira's truth was no longer locked in a drawer. One night, a woman messaged me. She said her younger sister had been acting strange, withdrawn. After reading Mira's words, she checked in, asked, gently. The sister broke down. She'd been afraid to speak, but now she had a voice. I stared at that message for a long time, and I wept. Not from sorrow, but from relief. Mira hadn't been loud. She hadn't screamed, but she had spoken. And now the world was finally listening. The first time I walked past a bookstore window and saw Mira's name on the cover of a memoir, I stopped breathing. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even her diary. Not really, not the full thing, just fragments, paired with essays, testimonies, observations on family, silence, complicity, and the 1,000 quiet ways a girl can disappear even while everyone swears they love her. The publisher had asked for permission, and I'd hesitated for days. But in the end, I said yes, because Mira deserved to be remembered for more than her pain. She deserved to be read, to be heard, not just in dusty corners of our family shame, but in the open, in the light. Arabella helped with the editing. She didn't want her name on anything, not publicly, but she combed through the drafts, suggested changes, rewrote whole transitions with a focus that surprised me. "This isn't about me," she said one day, eyes rimmed in red but steady. "It's about her." It always was. She still looked fragile, sometimes hollowed out, like the scaffolding holding her together had been rebuilt too quickly. But there was something else in her now too, an honesty I had never seen before. She'd sold the condo, cut off contact with Jasper entirely, went back to school, part-time, psychology. Of all things, "I want to work with girls like her," she'd said quietly, as if unsure whether she had the right. Girls like us. We didn't talk every day. Sometimes weeks passed without a word, but when she did reach out, it wasn't polite or performative. It was real, small things, honest things. A photo of her new violet tattoo, tiny and delicate behind her ear. A voice note saying she read one of Mira's poems to a support group, and someone cried. Or once, just once, a text that read, "I miss her. I miss you." I wrote back, "We're still here." One morning, months later, I received a package at my door. No sender name. Inside a small velvet box. And inside that, a charm, another violet, pressed in amber glass. Not Mira's, mine, a new one. And a note, "Your silence broke the silence. That takes more strength than anyone will ever know." I sat on my couch for hours, holding that charm, letting it warm in my palm. The weight of it wasn't heavy, it was anchoring. I'd returned to my work slowly. The app had launched to a modest but steady user base. Investors were circling. Freelancers were writing in, grateful for the structure. The project I'd once built in secret had grown a spine, a voice, just like me. But more than that, the story, Mira's story, had made its way into spaces I never expected. A college professor reached out, asking permission to use selected entries from her diary in a syllabus about digital vulnerability and the cost of silence. A non-profit contacted me about creating a resource guide based on her experiences. And one day, I received an email from a girl in Kentucky. She was 16. Her message was short. I thought I was alone. I thought no one would believe me. But Mira's words, they sound like mine. And now I'm not afraid to speak. That's when I understood. This wasn't about exposure. It was about continuity. Mira's voice didn't end in that diary. It echoed, it multiplied, and every time someone read her story and stepped forward to share their own, she lived again. One evening, I visited her grave alone. The headstone hadn't changed, still simple, still quiet, but now the space around it was full. Flowers, ribbons, a laminated copy of her poem, the one about growing in pain. Someone had underlined the last line in pink highlighter, "And pain is how we grow." I knelt beside the stone and smiled, not because the wound was gone, but because healing doesn't erase the scar, it turns it into proof. "I did it, Mira," I whispered. "They see you now. You're not a footnote. You're a voice." The wind stirred, the violets rustled, and for a moment I felt her, not as a ghost, not as grief, but as strength, as presence, as light breaking through long, silent fog. I walked away with my shoulders lighter, not because justice had been served, not because anyone apologised, but because I had said the one thing no one else dared to say when she was still breathing, I believe you. And now, so did the world. The book stayed on the bestseller list longer than anyone expected, not because it was scandalous, though some tried to paint it that way, but because it was true, because people saw themselves in Mira's words, in the ache between her lines, in the way she never once asked for pity, only understanding, and slowly, stories began to emerge, not just from readers, from within. An aunt messaged me, one I hadn't spoken to in years. She said she remembered seeing Jasper look at Mira too long once, at a barbecue. She told herself it was nothing. I was young too, she wrote, and scared of making a scene. But I knew, somewhere deep down, I knew. A former classmate of Mira's sent a letter. She said Mira had once tried to talk about something uncomfortable, but was brushed off. We were kids, she wrote, but I should have listened. Even Claire, sweet, blind Claire, reached out with trembling hands. She apologised for laughing when Arabella mocked me at dinner, for not asking questions, for treating me like a backdrop in my own family. I thought you were bitter, she admitted. I was, but I had every right to be. Arabella and I saw each other only once more in person. It was quiet, at a university panel on survivor narratives. I was invited to speak. She came unannounced, sat in the third row, and watched me with eyes that didn't blink. Afterward, she waited until the room cleared. You did it, she said. We did it. She shook her head. You held the line. You protected her voice. I was part of the silence. I can't undo that. No, I said. But you didn't stay silent. She looked at me for a long time, then pressed something into my hand, a folded photograph. Us. All three of us. Mira in the middle, grinning with sunflower petals in her teeth. Arabella holding a lopsided ice cream cone. Me, 11 years old, in a hoodie 3 sizes too big, squinting against the sun. I forgot this existed. I whispered. I didn't, she said, but I wasn't ready to see it again until now. We hugged, not tight, not cinematic, but real. And when we pulled away, we weren't sisters trying to fix everything. We were women carrying the same scar from different angles. Later that week, I stood on a small stage at a women's conference in Portland. Not glamorous, no cameras, just a folding chair, a mic, and 50 strangers in a half-lit room. I told them about Mira, about the silence that had wrapped around our family like ivy, about the dinner, the insult, the shift in Jasper's eyes. I didn't name him, not that day. Because the story wasn't about him. It never was. I read Mira's final poem aloud. When I looked up, half the room had tears in their eyes. Someone asked, "Do you think she forgave you?" I smiled. She never blamed me. I said, "That's what hurts the most. She kept loving us, even as we failed her." Afterward, a woman in her 60s came up and hugged me. No words, just held me like I was her daughter, or her younger self. That's when I understood something new. We don't always heal in the places we were wounded. Sometimes we heal in someone else's voice, in someone else's listening. Mira had given me the language, and I'd given it back to the world, not for revenge, not for redemption, but for recognition. So no one else would have to write their truth in secret. So no one else would feel like their pain had to die in a drawer. And in that way, She hadn't just survived. She'd grown through me, through Arabella, through every woman who whispered, "I believe her." And now, at last, so did I. Months passed. The headlines faded. The buzz slowed. And still, Mira's story lingered, not as noise, but as echo. I could feel her everywhere now, in ways that didn't haunt me but held me. In the quiet, in the soft flicker of a candle burning low, in the way the wind sometimes curved around my building like it was saying her name. I stopped searching for closure. That was never what this was about. Closure is an illusion we sell ourselves, a way to make grief palatable, clean. But grief is not clean. It's not tidy. It's not something you outgrow. It becomes part of you. And if you're lucky, if you're strong enough, it becomes something useful. It was a Thursday when I got the invitation. A non-profit was launching a program, a digital safety and storytelling initiative for young women. They wanted me to open the first session, not as a tech founder, not as a businesswoman, as Mira's sister. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to, but because part of me still didn't feel worthy. Like I'd arrived too late. Like my voice had only grown strong once hers was gone. But then I thought of that 16-year-old in Kentucky, of Arabella, reading that diary twice just to make sure she'd seen it right, of the girls who now had words where once they had silence. And I said yes. The event was simple. A circle of chairs in a sunlit room. Young faces, some brave, some broken, all trying to find the shape of their own voice. When it was my turn, I didn't bring a speech. I brought the violet charm around my neck and a copy of Mira's diary. I held it up and said, "This is the last thing my sister left me. Not jewellery, not money, not some picture-perfect legacy. Just this." I paused. She never got to say any of it out loud. She never got to live the life she deserved. But these words, they reached me. And now they've reached you, which means she's still here. The girls listened. Some cried. One asked if she could hold the diary. I let her. She cradled it like it was holy. When I stepped outside after the session, I found Arabella waiting in the hallway. I hadn't told her I'd be there, but she'd found out anyway. She always had a way of tracking down what mattered. "Still wearing that?" she asked, nodding to the charm. "Every day." She smiled. I started bringing violets to her grave. Fresh ones, whenever I can. She'd like that. There was a long pause. Then Arabella said something she never had before. "I used to hate you." I blinked. She wasn't crying, just honest. "I thought you were a mirror for everything I didn't want to see in myself." She continued, "Your failures made me feel superior. Your silence made me feel safe. But it was all a story I wrote to survive, in a house that never allowed softness. I didn't speak. I let her have her moment." She took a breath. "But you were always the strong one. You just didn't do it loudly." I stepped closer, touched her shoulder. We were both trying to breathe underwater. I said, "We just used different strokes." She nodded. We walked outside together. The sun was setting, soft gold over slate rooftops, the kind of light that doesn't demand attention but changes everything it touches. As we stood there, side by side, she said something I'd never forget. She was ours, but now she belongs to the world. And somehow, that makes me feel less alone. I smiled. Me too. The street was quiet. A breeze stirred, and in that silence, I could almost hear Mira's laugh again, the one that used to burst out mid-sentence, as if joy refused to wait. It didn't echo this time. It stayed, right here, where we could carry it. It was a grey morning when I finally returned to the house. Not the house I lived in now, the one I had chosen, furnished, and filled with my own quiet, but the other house. The house of cold dinners and folded napkins and stifled truths. The one where Mira's voice was once a whisper behind locked doors. It wasn't planned. I'd been driving through the neighbourhood on my way to a podcast recording, a show about legacy and narrative reclamation, when something tugged at me, an invisible thread pulling me back to where everything had once broken. I parked at the edge of the driveway. The garden was still immaculate, the hedges trimmed, the path lined with those smooth white stones my mother insisted looked refined. But the house felt smaller now, less intimidating, less like a fortress and more like a container for what we'd buried, what we'd denied, and what we'd finally brought into the light. I rang the bell. My mother answered. She looked older, not just in the soft lines around her mouth or the grey that now streaked her hair, but in her posture. She carried herself like someone who had seen too much, too late. Elara, she said, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say my name anymore. Hi. She stepped aside. No hug, just a quiet gesture. Inside, nothing had changed. The same framed oil painting above the fireplace, the same china in the cabinet, the same photograph of Arabella and Jasper on the hallway shelf, though, I noticed, turned slightly away from view, my father was in his chair, reading. He looked up as I entered, his face unreadable. You're back. Not for long. He nodded, slowly. Of course. I sat on the edge of the couch, fingers laced. They waited. I wanted to tell you in person. I said, the non-profit we partnered with, the one that started after Mira's book, it's launching a foundation in her name. My mother blinked. A foundation for girls like her, I said, with a voice, with stories, with families who won't or can't listen. There'll be scholarships, mental health services, a publishing wing for anonymous survivor narratives. My father cleared his throat. You're using the family name No. I said, just hers. Mira Voss. Nothing more. He didn't argue. That, in itself, was strange. My mother sat across from me, hands knotted in her lap. She was always writing. She whispered. I used to throw it away. Thought it was just nonsense. It wasn't. I said, it saved her. Even when we didn't. My father spoke again, softly. You think we're monsters. I paused, then shook my head. I think you were afraid of her truth, of what it meant about you, so you ignored it, and that made you complicit. Neither of them argued. The silence that followed wasn't combative. It was surrender, a quiet, belated reckoning. I stood. I don't need your approval. I said, I'm not here for that. My mother rose slowly. Her eyes searched mine. But you wanted us to know. Yes. She stepped forward, then stopped short. Will people know? They already do. A pause. Then my father looked up again, and for the first time in my life, he didn't sound like the voice at the end of a verdict. He sounded like a man who had run out of ways to pretend. Did she know we loved her? He asked. I felt something ache in my chest. She hoped you did, and I left. Not angry, not triumphant, just whole. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with flames or applause. Sometimes it looks like walking out of the house that once broke you and realizing it no longer holds power over your breath. Later that day, I arrived at the recording studio. The producer smiled. "You ready?" I nodded. We sat in the booth. The mic was warm, the room dim. They hit record. Today's guest, the host began, is a writer, founder, and survivor of generational silence. She's here to talk about her sister, about truth, and about the voice that rose from the quiet. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and spoke. The mic didn't tremble. My voice didn't crack. When I began to speak, it was like stepping into a room I'd once been locked out of. Only now, I had the key. I told Mira's story again. Not for the first time, but every time I told it, it shaped itself differently. Not because the facts changed, but because I began with the dinner. How Arabella smiled too hard. How my mother folded her napkins into swans. How my name felt like a filler in a toast meant for someone else. I described the way Jasper turned to me, the way his voice cut through the table like a knife, and how that single moment started to unravel everything we'd tried to bury. I spoke about the silence, about how families protect the wrong people, how shame teaches you to edit yourself until there's nothing left but politeness and performance. I spoke of Mira's diary, how each line was a thread, pulling me deeper into a truth I hadn't been ready to hold, and how, once I held it, I couldn't put it down. "And what do you want people to take from this?" the host asked gently, her voice steady in my headphones. "What do you want them to remember about Mira?" I didn't answer right away. I closed my eyes and saw her, not the fragile version, not the girl at the edge of everything, but the real her, laughing, hair messy, ink on her fingers, alive. I want them to know she existed in full colour, I said, not just in her trauma, not just as a warning. She was joy and poetry and rage and softness. She was worth loving, even when no one showed her how. The host paused, then spoke again, quieter now. "And what about you?" I smiled, slow. "I'm still learning how to be seen without waiting to be erased." When we wrapped the interview, the producer took off her headphones, eyes glassy. She didn't speak, just nodded once, like a bow, or maybe a thank you, too big for words. Outside, it had started to rain, light, almost invisible. I walked without an umbrella, let the cold kiss my skin. Each droplet felt like punctuation, like the universe saying you did it, you stayed, at home. I lit a candle, Mira's blend, lavender and violet. I opened my notebook, the same one that had held all my first scribbled thoughts when this story began, and wrote a single line: "She speaks. Still." That night, I received an email from a teacher in Canada. She said her 9th grade students were reading selections from Mira's writing in class, that they'd written their own anonymous letters afterward. She attached scans. One said, "I didn't know you could write pain like this. I didn't know you could survive it." Another, "I'm not ready to speak, but I want to." I wept again, not for Mira, but with her, because her voice hadn't ended in silence. It had travelled, in whispers, in underlines, in rooms she never entered but somehow filled. A week later, the foundation launched its first storytelling workshop. 40 girls. Half of them had never written anything before. The prompt was simple. What would you say if no one could interrupt you? One girl, no older than 13, stood up and read her piece aloud. Her voice shook. But she did not stop. When she finished, the room erupted in gentle applause. Arabella was there. She sat in the back row, hands clasped, eyes shining. She looked at me once, across the space, and nodded. Not approval, not pride, just presence. After the workshop, we walked together under a sky that looked like rain but held back. She'd be proud? Arabella said. She'd be surprised. I replied, she never thought anyone would listen. But they are, she said. They're listening because you did. I stopped walking, looked at the street around us, the faces, the lives moving past. She always said pain is how we grow. I whispered, but I think truth is how we begin. Arabella smiled, then hugged me, not tight, not dramatic, just real. I closed my eyes and let it hold, and I knew, in that moment, that the story didn't end here. It would keep going, through every girl who writes in the dark, every sister who speaks when no one else will, every survivor who finds herself not in the silence, but in the echo that comes after. Because Mira was never a tragedy. She was a spark, and now she burns in all of us.